All right. My name is Dena Robinson. It's really great to be in this space with you all today. I'm really excited to chat about transformative justice and how you can apply it to your life in small daily practices, as well as applying it to your workplace to really center safety, respect, and equity. I will pass it over really quickly to Adam to talk about some logistics, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
Hi, everyone. I'm Adam Jacobson on the SRE team. So welcome. And I'm here to help facilitate and, I'll be mostly in the chat, but just wanted to, at the top, just let you all know that, these conversations are off the record for press and, something that we hope will just keep contained within these bounds so that everyone can really feel free to speak with candor and lift up thoughts and ideas as they come. So we want to give this a feel of a Zoom room, as I've said in the chat. So we'll ask you to raise your hand by clicking the hand icon below the video screen, and then we'll be able to formally bring you into the chat. And then once we have everyone in there, we'll raise your hand. We encourage you to kind of raise your hand at the appropriate time and have a conversation at that point. So thank you, and let's have a good conversation.
Thanks, Adam. So I want to do some table setting to orient us around what we're going to be doing together. I know that the time that we have in this breakout isn't a ton of time, and so I'm going to try to get through as much of this as I can so that we can engage in conversation with each other. We're doing this breakout today so that you can learn about transformative justice and the way that it might transform you, your relationship with others, your relationship with yourself, and then shift you towards doing the actual work of collective liberation. I hope that you feel energized and reinvested and reengaged in the work that you do in your organization. And I hope that you feel eager and curious about how you might apply a transformative justice lens or framework to your own life and relationships. And so we're going to get there by a little bit of personal storytelling on my part. I'm going to give you an overview of transformative justice, what it is, what it isn't. We're going to talk about why it's useful and what you might gain from taking on transformative justice as a framework. And then we're going to talk about some of the micro ways to practice transformative justice on a day-to-day basis. And then I would like to open up the space for question and answer. So once we get there, please raise your hand, join me on stage, and we can have a conversation about transformative justice. And I invite you, as I go through this content, to think of the ways in which you've had conflict in your own lives, because what harm really is a form of conflict. So think about conflict that you've had in your life, whether in your intimate relationships with a partner or friends or other family members or in your workplace. And if you have any scenarios that are sitting with you as we go through this content, please feel free to bring that when you join the stage as well. So I wanted to share a bit about how I came to the work of transformative justice and why it's important to me. This is a picture of me as a little girl with my father, who I would consider to be one of my best friends in the world. He is someone that I have an immense amount of respect for. I love him dearly. And he is also someone who has committed deep harm. And I've committed deep harm too. We all have. And so I want you to hold that as I share this story and as we go through the rest of the content. Growing up, my parents had a very violent and toxic marriage. There was rampant domestic violence within my home growing up. And it started as a lot of intimate partner violence does, where there were a lot of arguments and yelling and screaming. And one day it escalated. And I'll offer a trigger warning here because I'm about to disclose an incident of domestic violence that I witnessed. But when I was about 6 or 7 years old, I saw my father choking my mom. And I remember running up to him, banging on his leg, saying, "Let go of my mommy." And I share this story because most people, given what my father has done in the past, would immediately discard him and throw him away. I remember calling the police. At the time, I did not yet understand the carceral state or the harm that comes into communities and families when a family member interfaces with the criminal legal system, but that's what I did because that's what I thought I had to do. And thankfully, my father did not end up going to prison. My parents went through their own mini transformative justice framework, so to speak. But what I learned from that experience was that a breach against one person is a breach against everyone else in that community, whether that's a family unit, whether it's a neighborhood, or whether it's a workplace. And it also taught me the importance of viewing the complexity that my father had. He was someone who had committed a harm against my mother, but that did not make him a monster. It made him someone who did a bad thing. It did not make him himself bad. And so I share this because so much of the work of transformative justice is holding that nuance and complexity and knowing that people can do bad things. We've all done bad things. I've done bad things and I've caused immense hurt to people around me, whether I know it or I don't know it. But transformative justice asks us to believe that people have the capacity to change and transform. And in witnessing my father, I've seen the ways that he has changed and transformed from the person who was able to do something so traumatic to my mother to the man that he is today. Oops. So with that, I'll share what transformative justice is. And as I'm going along, feel free to throw any reactions that you're having into the chat. What's coming up for you? I want to hear all of it. So if you are someone who was a child, as we all were in the past, you may or may not have experienced punitive or retributive justice. If we were in, a room together, I would ask you to raise your hand if you ever experienced a parent sending you to timeout because of something you did, or if you ever experienced being expelled or suspended from school or grounded even for something that you did. That's what we're used to as children. And it's the water that we swim in this country specifically. And as we age and become adults, that punitive justice turns into things like the criminal legal system, locking people up in prison, locking people up in jail, committing people to the death penalty and the death sentence. So that's what punitive justice is, which is the norm for us. Restorative justice is something that has really exploded in popularity over the past couple of years, especially in the K through 12 education system. And restorative justice is a good step in the right direction. I will say that it acknowledges and repairs the harm that happened in a community. Some of you may have gone through a restorative justice framework or process yourself using circles, where you all talk about how you were harmed. The person who committed the harm is there listening to the ways in which they've breached against the community. They acknowledge that harm. They try to repair the harm in some way. And restorative justice is really focused on individuals and asks us to restore people to how they were before the harm occurred. But the problem with restorative justice is that the harm occurs and the person goes back into their community, but some of the underlying conditions that may have led to that harm, whether that's, trauma, whether it's a lack of access to resources, if we're thinking about someone who, let's say, for instance, broke into someone's home and stole something, right? Those underlying conditions are still present, which is one of the limits of restorative justice. Transformative justice, on the other hand, is completely radical. And when I say the word radical, I'm using Angela Davis's definition, which is to grasp things from the root. And that's what transformative justice does. It's about really digging deep into the roots of what causes the harm and transforming those conditions so that you don't reproduce and continue perpetuating harm later on. And for that reason, transformative justice is not a framework that works with the state. The state, and when I say the state, I'm talking about governments, courts, the police, prisons, focus on punitive justice, or they sometimes focus on restorative justice. But transformative justice is different because it's about us. It's about my relationship to you, your relationship to me, my relationship to my partner, my relationship to my neighbors, and how I hold conflict and use conflict to to deepen my relationship with others. So we're transforming those underlying conditions. Transformative justice is something that has always been practiced in this country and around the world by marginalized groups like folks with disabilities, LGBTQ people, trans folks, people of color, Black folks, because for us, and I say that for myself because I hold multiple intersecting identities and multiple marginalized identities, we have never been able to rely on the state for our safety, our care, and support until pretty recently. And so this is a practice that has very long roots in this country and a very rich history. But the one thing I would say about transformative justice, and I know that it sounds really nebulous, which is why we're going to talk about how you can live it out in your day to day life, is that it is a practice. You are always practicing with transformative justice. And what you're holding at the root of transformative justice is that we have all been complicit in harm in some way, that when a harm occurs in our community, we have all been complicit in it. We are all impacted by it because a breach against our fellow human being is a breach against us. And we're holding that we all have the capacity to transform and change. And we're really centering each other's humanity. And it's a practice that is rooted in abolition. So we're not trying to get the police involved. We're not trying to involve the criminal legal system, though I recognize that that is the dominant structure that we live in. And so sometimes that will be factored in, but we're really trying to practice what it looks like to be liberatory with each other and really be in relationship with each other. So these are some of the goals of transformative justice. So you're pushing individuals to recognize the harm that they've committed, even if it wasn't intentional. So it's really the impact versus intent framework or dichotomy. We're acknowledging the impact that the harm had on the individuals around the person who caused the harm, the impact that it had on the person who caused the harm themselves, and the wider community. Then you're doing the repair and restitution work, which is similar to restorative justice. But then we are developing the skills that we need to make sure that we are not reproducing that behavior. And we're changing the roots and the conditions that that person and that community has been swimming in so that the harm doesn't occur again. So why do we need transformative justice and what is in it for you? There are a lot of skills that you'll gain practicing transformative justice. You'll learn to hold complexity because when we think about the criminal legal system or when we think about punitive justice, we live in a society where you're either good or bad. There's no middle ground. And as I think we all know, most of us exist somewhere on a spectrum, right? There are parts of us that are good and parts of us that are bad. But when we live in a society that has these false binaries, it's very easy for us to lock people up and throw away the key, to cancel them completely, and to say, you know what, you are going to be cast off the island because you did this thing or because you did multiple things. So transformative justice asks us to really hold that nuance and to take a mirror and look at ourselves to see the ways that we have also committed these harms. In doing so, you'll deepen your relationship to yourself and others. Transformative justice asks us to practice hard honesty, and it's really hard to look yourself in the face and say, wow, I am someone who has committed harm. But if you can acknowledge that you're someone who's committed harm, you can surely acknowledge that you are not a monster, which means that other people who commit harm are not monsters either. They are people who are doing bad things. You'll learn to give yourself some grace and practice mistakes because, as I said again, transformative justice is really a practice and it's something that we need to take on every single day. It's not just a framework and it's not just a theory. And in doing all of these things, you'll begin to transform your relationship with yourself, your relationship with the people around you, and ultimately these transformations will have ripple effects for the rest of society. So I briefly wanted to share some ways that you can take on transformative justice as an everyday practice. One of them is something that I actually did today with my partner. If someone shares with you that you have hurt or harmed them in some way, you can listen before responding. You can notice the ways that you feel resistant to what the person is saying. what's happening for you in your body as someone is saying, you did something that hurt me? Are you becoming defensive? Are you trying to run through every single reason why you did what you did? That's one way to practice transformative justice in relationship. You can use the question why to get a deeper understanding of what someone means. So why do we want to kick this person out of our organization because of what they did? Why do I want to end my relationship with this person because of what they did? And keep asking why. And you can keep asking that person who harmed you why as well. You can ask what you can learn from something, because a part of transformative justice is really resisting the dichotomy. And everything presents us with the opportunity to learn a lesson, even big mistakes. And when a harm has occurred in our communities, in our workplaces, and in our relationships, that's actually an invitation for us to go deeper and to deepen that relationship and to learn from the harm that occurred. A really practical way that you could practice transformative justice is by creating a pod. And essentially, pods are groups that hold each other accountable for either perpetuating harm. So this might be a group of people that you go to be like, I really didn't show up well in this interaction with my coworker today, and I need to talk about it. Your pod may also be a group of people that you would turn to if you've experienced harm and you need people to support you in that. You can share with folks in your community what you need to show up as your best self. That's a way to practice transformative justice. So communicating your wants and needs, communicating your boundaries, and respecting those of others is another concrete way to practice transformative justice. So now I'd love to have folks join me on the stage, bring any scenarios that you're thinking of that are really sitting with you in terms of transformative justice. I'd love to hear the resistance that you feel, if at all, about transformative justice and trying it on. What parts feel really sticky or icky to you? Anything that you'd like to share, I'm willing to engage in conversation about it. And I know it'll take a minute for folks to join the stage. So one thing I'll voice over as folks are joining, and I think there was one person in the chat who wanted to come in, is that with transformative justice, it's really the little things. And the idea is that by practicing these little habits day to day, we're building the literal muscle to be able to deal with the really huge, egregious breaches. Because often in our society, we deal with things once they've reached that, monumentous, horrible, horrific act, but we're not dealing with the little conflicts that, ratchet up over time to actually get there. And so practicing transformative justice in these tiny ways helps us to build the muscle to actually do that. Hey, Elizabeth. She might still, I don't see her, so she might still be joining. But I'll say, as we wait to hear from Elizabeth, that transformative justice can be thinking about how you give a good apology. It can be thinking about how you're practicing consent in your relationships or even at work. Are you pushing people to do things that they don't want to do? That might be a question that you ask yourself. How do you really sit with conflict and tension in your relationships, in your families, etc.? So lots of little ways to practice it. Not okay. So I see a question. Putting the onus on the abuser and not the abused. Does transformative justice encourage that? So transformative justice is centered around the survivor or the victim of the harm, and it, in some transformative justice processes, if you work with the survivor might say, I actually don't want this person to be kicked out of this organization. And if that's really what the survivor wants, that's absolutely fine. but there would need to be work done to address the way that that breach harmed the entire community, because at the end of the day, there was stuff happening in that community that led to that person being able to commit that harm, whether it was people looking the other way, whether it was people not feeling empowered enough to say anything, whether it was people not feeling like they could even hold that person accountable or have a conversation with that person. So it's, it's a push and pull, but the whole point of transformative justice is that with the abuser, we don't want to just cast them out. We may need to remove them for the safety of the person that they harmed initially, but we're trying to find ways, if the survivor or the victim is okay with that, to reintegrate that person into the community. I hope that answers that question. And I encourage folks to throw questions into the chat if you have others, or join me on stage. Oh, oh, hello. Hi, Zoe.
Hi, I was wondering how you sort of deal with transformative justice when there's imbalances in power. I feel like often these conversations end up happening where there's like a boss that's in charge of a group of people, or a lot of times with like young people when it's adult and young people reconciling, and how you make sure that there's sort of equal footing for everyone despite maybe the sort of isms that like adultism or racism or whatever sort of isms might take place in those spaces, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that's a really important question. So I think, I would say some of it gets to or goes to practicing engaging in that conflict generally, because I think you're right that, speaking for myself, um, at my previous organization, I was an employee and I had a lot of conflict with my supervisor. I'll be completely honest. I don't think she related to me well as a Black woman. And it was really uncomfortable having the conversations that we had sometimes, where I was trying to call her in to the values that she said she was practicing, um, and I knew that that hierarchy existed. So I think in those scenarios, it's sometimes helpful to have a mediator present. If it's a huge breach, that would be helpful, just to make sure that every person is heard and listened to and respected. But I think if we do the work every day to practice being in conflict with each other, or a leader says, I really want your feedback, and they actually mean it, and you know that if you go and give them feedback, they're not going to curse you out or something, or fire you or retaliate against you, then that can help when you get to those larger breaches. And it's challenging, I think, because many of the conflicts that we see arising in the workplace, they stem from an I'm not going to say an inability on part of the parties involved, but just a culture where we don't actually communicate well with each other. It's difficult. It's not really a skill that we learn growing up, in my opinion. And so we learn it through conflict and through conflicts with each other as we're adults. And it's really hard and really uncomfortable and really scary. But every time that we welcome that opportunity to engage in conflict, even if it's scary, it will help us get to the other side. And I think that's true whether you have the hierarchy or not. But I think even naming the hierarchy is important.
Please, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Can I share any examples of transformative justice working well in organizational and institutional settings? What were the conditions that made it possible? I know I'm going to sound like a broken record by saying this, and I apologize. But I have heard of transformative justice working well in organizational settings. Well, I'll take that back. More in institutions, but I have heard of organizations that practice transformative justice. And those are organizations that are actively going out into communities to practice transformative justice. In terms of the conditions that made it possible, from what I have read and learned, these are organizations that were having those conversations that I mentioned before, doing trainings to figure out what an apology actually is. How do you say I'm sorry? How do you acknowledge the harm that you've committed without becoming defensive? So there are organizations that are doing that work. They are engaging in work around dialoguing. What does it mean to listen to understand versus listen to respond? What does it mean to be a deep listener? Engaging in the kind of work where they're introspective and they're reflecting on, what do I need if I've been harmed? How do I know in my body when I'm feeling triggered? All of the work that a lot of organizations actually don't engage in are what organizations that practice TJ successfully are doing and have been doing. I think in recognition that, you are a whole person, right? When you enter into any space that you come in, you're coming in with all of your lived experiences, you're coming in with all of your triggers, you're coming in with your traumas, everything. And you deserve to be seen in the fullness of your humanity. And so a lot of organizations don't engage in that work. One of the things that I often do when I have meetings with folks, and this is whether I'm meeting in my capacity as a DEI facilitator or if I'm meeting with people in my capacity as a trial attorney, I'll ask them, how are you doing right now in your mind, body, and spirit? Because I want to center their humanity and I want to know what's coming into the space with this person that I should be aware of. And are there ways that I can help to support them right now? And that's the kind of work that organizations need to be doing if they want to practice transformative justice successfully. Oh, I see someone's trying to come on the stage if we have time. And yes, I do have resources. I have 2 books that I'd love to share with y'all really quickly. We Will Not Cancel Us is one. It's by Adrienne Marie Brown. It's about transformative justice. And then Beyond Survival is another text that I'd recommend. And they detail a lot of organizations that are doing this work well, mistakes they've made, lessons they've learned, etc. Hi, Danielle. Oh, I can't hear you, but no, not yet. But take your time. Um, and I have a QR code up on the screen, just for my own personal use to get your feedback. But if you fill out the survey that's linked to the QR code, I can email you some additional resources later today. No, I can't hear you now. Oh, no, I'm sorry. It's good to see your face, though. And let's see. I'm looking at some places that are doing transformative justice work. There's the Trans Lifeline, does transformative justice work. Mia Mingus would be a good person to follow if you'd like to learn more about transformative justice work. Miriam Kaba is like the mother in some ways of abolition work, and she does a lot of work around transformative justice as well. So there are a lot of resources out there. And I spoke earlier about pods. Mia Mingus created a tool called a pod mapping worksheet where you can think about the folks that you would call on for support if you harmed or had been harmed. And yes, I can type them in here as well. Okay. And I see we have about 5 minutes left. So if anyone has any additional questions, I would love to hear from you. I would love for you to join me on stage. Any questions you have at all. And you're also free to email me on the side. And I'm just typing these resources into the chat. Okay. And I'll say, I'm a huge proponent of transformative justice, but I won't pretend that it's easy work. I don't think engaging in conflict with the people that we care about, let alone, strangers, is easy. It's not easy. It's really hard. It's really difficult. It brings up a lot for us internally. I know it brings up a lot for me. And to reconnect this all back to the story I shared about my dad, I think growing up as a child, I conflated abuse with conflict. And conflict and abuse aren't the same thing. But we have gotten so used to feeling that way as a society, and it makes sense because we all have a lot of triggers. Conflict is scary. And a lot of my work since growing up and becoming an adult has been to separate conflict from abuse, separate guilt from shame, and know that if I harm someone, it doesn't mean I'm a monster. It doesn't mean that I'm a bad person. It means that I did a bad thing. So I just wanted to share that because conflict can feel really scary and it can feel really violent, but it can be generative. To answer Danielle's question, what might it look like for us to start teaching our children in this new way? So, okay, in educational communal settings and in parenting, one of the biggest things that I think that parents and educators alike can do with young people is model for them how to engage in generative conflict. And so for me, when I was in the classroom, that looked like owning up to the mistakes that I'd made to my students, apologizing to my students if I harmed them in some way, and asking my students to let me know if I'd ever harmed them, and to ask them how I can make repair. And when I've done that with young people, elementary school students, middle school students, high school students, I think it's been really refreshing for them because young people are not used to adults apologizing to them for anything. I certainly wasn't growing up, but that's a skill that we have to model for them because many of us, we're not steeped in transformative justice as a culture. We're steeped in the punitive justice. And so we need to plant little seeds along the way for the young people who are going to come behind us. Because I don't want the young people who are going to eventually be my descendants to know no other way to engage in conflict other than to lock someone up or to kick them out of whatever community that they're in and isolate them because of something that they've done. I want them to know that we all have the capacity to change and transform, and we all have the capacity to heal the communities that we're in. So I would say that's one big step, is just modeling that. And if you have kids, modeling in front of your kids what it looks like to engage in conflict with your partner or with the other adults around you. Kids really are like sponges, and they will soak up every single thing that you're teaching them. So to the extent that you can show them that in real time and even talk through your process in engaging in conflict, I think that would be really helpful. All right. So I know we have about 1 minute left. So I'm going to ask y'all if you could scan this QR code with your phone and fill out my little feedback form. If you do, I'll be sure to send you some additional resources via email. My email address is also here, and I'll throw it into the chat. I'd love to continue engaging in conversation with y'all about this. I run a little book club called the Pleasure Club, which is a pod community where we hold each other accountable around transformative justice specifically. And so I'm always down for opportunities to continue talking about this, to support other people in their transformative justice journey with their self, their community members, family, friends, etc. And I thank you all for engaging in conversation with me. Thanks, y'all.